And I just want to take a moment. I went through the participants list. Some of my mentors are on that list. So it is such a delight. I want to just honor the elders in and amongst us. There is so many years of expertise reflected in this room. And I know that we are talking to a room full of people who really understand what's going on here. And so I'm going to dive in a little bit into some of the political narratives that we're hearing around cities, get into the weeds a little bit, specifically on equitable climate action. So first, I want to take a moment. Klaus has really helped us understand that global perspective. So I'm going to dig into Canada, look at cities in Canada. And for those of you who are coming from other countries, I just want to point out that we're living in this important tension moment with cities. We're seeing new political narratives about cities, and these might be familiar for you in your context as well. So on the one hand, we know that cities are on the front line of just about every social and environmental challenge, and that cities in Canada, if you look at the statistics, are leading the way on climate action. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a new narrative emerging that is really vilifying cities. It's calling them gatekeepers, an unnecessary level of government and really in the way of development. So we've even heard some provincial, some federal politicians talk about cities, and if they don't get out of the way of development, especially on housing, they're going to lose their federal infrastructure dollars. So I just want us to take a moment and think about housing. Housing is not about developing a building. And if we take this integrated approach, we're talking about building community with access to clean water, with access to energy, sewage, waste removal, and the broader supports like roads, parks, schools, health, social infrastructure pieces, the policing, etc. So I actually think, and I'd make the argument that I think cities are our most important level of government, not only because, as Robert Putnam says, they're closest to the people whom they govern, but they're absolutely essential in how we thrive. And the first place we go to when we need to be evacuated, as so many have been, from wildfires, from floods, when you need cooling from extreme heats, when you need shelter during freezing temperatures. So I've spent the last 20 years working with cities because I do see them as the most critical space for really dealing with also GHG reductions in climate. So earlier this week, ICLEI Canada and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities actually published a report on the state of climate action in our country. And there's two slides I want to share with you. The first is a map of our country, and that is based on the percentage of municipalities that have climate action plans. Now, it's impressive to see how far cities have come in Canada in moving forward in climate action. When I started Carbon Talks, that was so many years ago. I really had to look at Mark Roseland, who I know is on the line's first reports, Bill Reese's work, to really understand what cities were doing. But now, after looking, if you look, almost 70% of cities across the country, municipalities, have active climate action plans. And so that's really important. Now, the second slide really talks about when a city takes climate action, what do they do? And this falls into some broad categories that ICLEI and FCM have identified. They generally look on buildings and mobility and transportation, community energy and retrofits, agricultural forestry, land use planning, industrial processes. I often use more generic things, and I think, Klaus, you talked about some of these, the green infrastructure, stormwater management, waste management, energy, food security, consumption. I'd invite any of you to put into the chat any of the specific things where you don't see those categorized in the buckets on that list. Add them to the chat on areas that your cities are working on climate action. We can stop sharing the screen. Thanks. Now, the best work I've seen in cities is when cities take a living systems approach. It was surprising to me to come back to Canada and hear adaptation mitigation all over again. I haven't heard that in a while. It's not really the way I think about it. It's really, and I think Fair Earth Living, I think C40, I think OneEarth have really taken integrated approaches. Groups that work in circular economy, social and environmental procurement, workforce training, those are examples of living systems approaches. And at the heart of these approaches is we center equity, we center engagement, the health, safety, well-being of people, and the planet. And these are approaches that really address not just the reality of today, but we're also protecting the needs of future generations. And so that's really critical. And I think we can learn a lot from our Indigenous communities and the philosophers and the thinkers from within Indigenous communities about how to do that more holistically. Now, as we look at cities as living systems, we're also using, as Klaus said, all the power of the cities, all the tools in our toolbox. We're also collaborating across sectors with community groups, business, labor, other levels of government, because cities can never do it alone. This is a problem-solving and networked approach. And I want to get into the weeds, and I want to just talk about one initiative with the time I have. And this is an initiative I'm doing with Urban Climate Leadership and MakeWay, which is looking at dismantling obstacles to equitable climate action by cities. And I'm digging in really deeply. In fact, I'm at a heat pump symposium, because the focus of our work is how do we solve for putting heat pumps low rise. By low rise, I mean 3- and 4-story buildings to support the heating and cooling. Now, we have over 5,400 low rise 3- and 4-story multi-unit residential buildings, or MURBs, in Metro Vancouver. And this is where actually most of our social housing, our supported housing, our low income, mixed, affordable home ownership, if there was such a thing like that in Vancouver, this is where it exists. And this is also where the people who are most vulnerable to extreme heating and freezing temperatures, who are most vulnerable to the impacts of pollution and climate, live. Now, in 2021, for those of you who know the Vancouver heat dome situation, you would know that 619 people died of the extreme heat from that heat dome. So ensuring that people in low-rise MURBs get adequate and affordable heating and cooling for residents is an absolute priority. And it is a priority in words for all levels of government. But there's no easy way to pathway to decarbonization. So let's think about this. I thought heat pumps, that's easy. It's not. It's very complex. Many of these buildings were built in the 1950s to the 1980s. They were built for the energy needs of 50 years ago, not what we need now. They weren't necessarily built to withstand earthquakes. They might have asbestos that needs abatement. They likely don't have great insulation, probably haven't had windows that have been upgraded or lighting that's been upgraded. And this is where it gets really complex. Most are centrally heated with gas-powered boilers, potentially hot water radiated heaters, forced air. They were built to the lot size, the limits of their lot size. And I think this is the most important. Most of them don't have adequate funds or any potential to raise the funds that would enable the deep retrofits that are necessary to put in something as simple as a heat pump. So this is complex. Even a place I used to live, the Bell Manor Equity Co-op here in the West End of Vancouver, I sold my place to one of the best green architects in the city. I thought if anybody could transition this building to heat pumps, it was these folks. And they tried. But at $1.2 million for a 14-unit building with most of the people on limited income, couldn't afford it. So here you have a building with all of the residents wanting to transition, but not finding a way to do that affordably without dislocating at least half the units, because they'd have to sell to pay for the financing. So that's where urban climate leadership is. We're working with the landlords, the cooperatives, the nonprofit housing operators, the strata councils, every level of government. Think of all the players, from the manufacturers, the contractors, the builders, the financiers, the capacity builders, and educators. We're working with all of them to multi-solve for this issue. How are we going to get there? And we're not going to stop until we figured it out for this space, this place. And then when we have a case study, we're going to take it to other places and really learn what can be scaled. So this is an example of what it means to actually deliver on equitable climate action. It's not easy. It's not going to be simple, but it requires all of us to be working in a much more networked, clustered approach. So I'm not going to keep going because I want to give us lots of space for talks. There's many more examples. I had a chance to sit on the Earthshot Technical Advisory Committee this year and got to see some of the most amazing innovations that cities are doing. Cities are on the front line, but they're not perfect. We know they're not perfect. They are a third level of government. They don't have the financial capacity to deliver what they do, but we've got to create a new thinking, a new shifting of our paradigm in terms of how we think about governance and how we deliver on our climate action. So I'm working there, and I think the focus and the integrated thinking that the sustainable living and the sustainable consumption folks that are bringing here today is absolutely critical to our thinking, and supporting and investing in cities in this integrated systems way is critical.